The morning my wife passed, the dogwood tree in our front yard was in full bloom. I remember standing on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the white petals drift down onto the driveway, and thinking that the world had no business being that beautiful on a day like that. Patricia had planted that tree the spring after we moved in. She said she wanted something that came back every year to remind us that things don't stay gone forever. I used to think that was the most hopeful thing I'd ever heard. After she died, I wasn't so sure. Her name was Patricia Ann Mercer, and she was my wife for 39 years. We raised our son Robert in that house on Caldwell Lane in Franklin, Tennessee. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a backyard that backed up to a creek where Robert used to catch crawdads as a kid. I built the back deck myself with wood I milled at the shop where I worked for 22 years. Every nail in that house had a memory attached to it. When Patricia got sick and then was gone in a matter of months, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum of a life I used to have. Robert called me every single day that first year. He drove up from Nashville on weekends and sat with me at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking about nothing, the way men do when they don't know how to say what they really mean. He looked like his mother around the eyes. Same way of tilting his head when he was listening to you. I couldn't always look straight at him without feeling the grief all over again, but I never told him that. He was trying so hard. It was his idea for me to move in with them. He called one evening in January, about 14 months after Patricia passed, and he said, "Dad, I don't like you being alone out there. The winters are getting worse and you're not getting any younger." I told him I was 67, not 107, but he laughed and said he knew that, and that it wasn't just about my age. He said he missed having me close. That got me. I agreed before I'd even thought it through. His wife's name was Vanessa. They'd been married 6 years at that point. She was 38, worked in pharmaceutical sales, drove a white BMW, and kept the house so clean it looked like a magazine photo rather than a place people actually lived. The first time I visited, before I ever moved in, she showed me around like she was a realtor and I was a potential buyer, pointing out the crown molding and the quartz countertops. I smiled and nodded. I thought she was just proud of her home. I didn't understand yet what the tour was really about. When I moved in, she gave me the guest room at the end of the hall. It had a small closet and a window that faced the neighbor's brick wall, but I wasn't complaining. I arranged my few things, set up the photo of Patricia on the dresser, and told myself this was a good decision. Robert seemed genuinely happy that I was there. He'd come home from work and knock on my door before he even took off his coat, just to say hello. Vanessa's attitude toward me shifted within the first 2 weeks. It was subtle at first. She mentioned, casually, that she preferred the house quiet in the mornings because she needed to concentrate before her first sales calls. I woke up at 5:30 out of habit 40 years of early mornings. Don't just stop, so I started making my coffee in the dark, moving around the kitchen in socks like a man trying not to wake a sleeping animal. Then she said the television in the living room was too loud in the evenings and suggested I use headphones. Then it was that she and Robert liked to have dinner alone on weeknights to decompress from their days. She said it with a smile, framing it as something perfectly reasonable, and maybe it was. I told myself couples needed their space. I started eating in my room. Robert noticed. One Saturday morning, he found me sitting alone at the kitchen table at 6 a.m. and asked why I was eating cereal by myself like I was hiding from something. I told him I was just giving him and Vanessa their privacy. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Dad, this is your home too." I told him I was fine. I should have told him the truth. The months went on. Vanessa started making small comments about how I was underfoot when she was hosting her friends, about how my tools in the garage were taking up too much space, about how the smell of the wood stain I used on a birdhouse project was giving her headaches. Each individual complaint was something a reasonable person could understand, but taken together, stacked one on top of another, they started to feel like something else. They felt like a slow, patient campaign to make me understand that I was not welcome, that I was a problem to be managed. I started spending more time on the back porch, staying out of the flow of the house. I read a lot of books. I called my old buddy Frank Dawson from the shop 2 or 3 times a week just to hear a familiar voice. I didn't tell Frank what was happening. I was embarrassed, I think. What do you say? My daughter-in-law makes me feel like a stranger in my son's house. It sounded like the kind of complaint an old man makes when he can't adjust to change. So I stayed quiet and adjusted. Then Robert got sick. It started as what he thought was a bad case of the flu. He was tired all the time, losing weight, said his chest felt tight when he climbed the stairs. He was 43 years old and had never had a serious health problem in his life. I told him to see a doctor. Vanessa told him he was probably just stressed from work. He took some time off, but he didn't improve. By the time he finally went in for a full workup, the news was not good. His heart had been weakening for months, the cardiologist said. It was a condition called dilated cardiomyopathy. The doctor said it sometimes appeared in otherwise healthy men in their 40s without any obvious warning. I sat in the waiting room of that hospital with my hands folded in my lap and told myself that my son was going to be okay, that we had caught it, that medicine could fix this. Robert took it better than I did. He was calm about it in the way he had always been, calm, practical, focused on what could be done rather than what couldn't. He made changes to his diet, started cardiac rehab, took his medications religiously. There were good weeks. There were weeks where I let myself believe he would pull through. We sat on the back porch on Sunday afternoons, the two of us, and talked about old times. He wanted to hear stories about his mother, about the early years when we were young and broke and happy. I told them all. I held nothing back. He died on a Tuesday morning in March. He was getting ready for work. Vanessa said she found him in the bedroom. The paramedics said it was sudden cardiac arrest. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. He was 43 years old. I don't have words for those first days. Some things are beyond language. I moved through the house like a shadow, not eating, not sleeping, sitting in Robert's chair in the living room because it still smelled like him. Patricia and Robert, both gone. I was 68 years old and I had outlived the two people I loved most in the world. Vanessa, in those first days, was composed in the way a person is composed when they have been preparing themselves for something. She cried at the funeral. She accepted condolences graciously. She arranged the reception at the house and made sure there was enough food. I watched her from across the rooms and thought that grief takes people differently, and that I had no right to judge how she handled hers. 3 weeks after the funeral, she knocked on my bedroom door. She sat down in the chair across from the bed and folded her hands in her lap, and I recognized immediately the posture of someone delivering prepared remarks. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said that this house held too many painful memories for her, and that she was planning to sell it and relocate. She said she was sorry, but she would need me to find somewhere else to live. She said she thought 30 days was a reasonable timeline. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I asked her if she had spoken with Robert's attorney. Something crossed her face. Just for a second, a tightening around the eyes. She said she was in the process of handling all of the estate matters. She said the house was hers now and that she needed to move forward with her life. She said it gently. The way you say something to a person you have already decided is not going to cause you any trouble. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I would think about my options. She left, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet, and I thought about a conversation I'd had with Robert 4 months earlier. It had been a Sunday in November. We were out on the back porch, and Robert had been quieter than usual. After a while, he said, "Dad, I want you to know that whatever happens, you're going to be okay." I told him I knew that. He shook his head and said he needed me to really hear him. He said, "I've been thinking about things, planning ahead. I just want you to know it's all taken care of." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me with those eyes that were so much like his mother's and said, "You'll find out when you need to." I didn't want to make things uncomfortable while I'm still here, but it's handled. I promise you, it's handled. I hadn't let myself think too hard about what he meant at the time. I think I didn't want to acknowledge that he was preparing for the possibility of dying. But sitting on that bed after Vanessa's visit, his words came back to me with a new and very specific weight. I called his attorney the next morning. Robert had used a man named Gerald Ashworth in Nashville, a real estate and estate planning attorney he'd been working with for several years. When I said my name, Gerald's assistant put me through immediately. Gerald said he had been expecting my call. He said Robert had been in to see him the previous October, 3 months before he passed. He said Robert had made some arrangements that I needed to know about. He asked me to come into the office. I drove to Nashville the next morning. Gerald Ashworth was a careful, methodical man who laid documents on the desk like he was presenting evidence in a trial, which I suppose is exactly what he was doing. He explained that Robert had executed a life estate deed on the house. Under the terms of the deed, Robert had retained legal ownership of the property for his lifetime, but upon his death, ownership passed not to his wife but to me. Robert had researched the option carefully. He had structured it so that it was legally airtight and filed with the county recorder's office. Gerald had the recorded copy. The house on Caldwell Lane was mine. There was something else. Gerald said Robert had left a USB drive in his possession, with instructions that it be given to me if anything happened to him. I took it home that afternoon, plugged it into my laptop, and sat back. There were 2 files on the drive. The first was a video. Robert was sitting at his desk at home, speaking quietly and directly into the camera. He looked tired but steady. He said he loved me. He said he was sorry he hadn't found a way to tell me things directly, but that some conversations would have made the situation at home impossible to manage, and he needed time to get everything in order first. He said he had begun to suspect, over the previous year, that Vanessa had been planning to leave him. He said he had found things, financial records, communications that suggested she had been moving money out of their joint accounts for months, setting herself up to leave. He said he believed that she had married him in part for financial security and that, when it became clear his health was declining, she had begun making arrangements to ensure she walked away with as much as possible. He said he didn't want me to be collateral damage in whatever was coming. He said the house had been his gift to me all along, ever since I moved in, because he knew, even then, that he wasn't going to let me end up with nothing. The second file was a folder of documents. Spreadsheets, account statements, screenshots of wire transfers, 11 months of financial records showing a methodical pattern, money moved from their joint savings into a private account in Vanessa's name only. Robert had quietly documented all of it. He had also noted, in a typed memo at the end of the folder, that he had consulted with a cardiologist independently of his regular care team, and that the second doctor had raised a question. His specific type of cardiac deterioration had a presentation that could, in rare circumstances, be consistent with prolonged low-dose exposure to certain compounds. The doctor had told him it was unlikely and that he shouldn't alarm himself. Robert wrote that he probably wasn't alarmed, but he wrote it down. He documented the conversation, the date, the doctor's name. He documented it like a man who understood that documentation matters. I sat with that file open on my screen for a long time. I called Gerald Ashworth the following morning and told him what was in the folder. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he had 2 pieces of advice. First, that we respond formally to any attempt by Vanessa to sell or claim the property by serving notice of the life estate and my ownership rights. Second, that I take Robert's memo about the independent cardiologist to law enforcement and let them decide what to do with it. I did both things within the week. Vanessa's attorney contacted Gerald's office with a challenge to the deed transfer, claiming it had been executed under duress or without proper capacity. Gerald filed our response within 48 hours. He had the recorded deed, the notarized signatures, and documentation of Robert's full legal competence at the time of signing. He also had the timeline. The deed was filed 4 months before Robert's death, at a time when Robert had been attending cardiac rehab, communicating clearly with his medical team, and consulting with his attorney on multiple matters. There was no argument. I sat in Gerald's office the afternoon Vanessa's attorney withdrew the challenge. Gerald slid the withdrawal notice across the desk and said, "The house is yours, Harold. Uncontested." I nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel when something that was always true finally gets said out loud. The financial fraud case was referred to the district attorney's office. Investigators began looking at the account transfers, the timeline, the amounts. Vanessa retained a criminal defense attorney within the week. I don't know exactly what she was told by her lawyer, but I know that she moved out of the house on Caldwell Lane on a Wednesday in late April, quietly, while I was not home. She took what was hers and left everything else. As for the independent cardiologist's concerns, that investigation moved more slowly, as those things do. Authorities requested Robert's full medical records and consulted with a forensic cardiologist. I was told the process would take time. I was told to be patient. I don't know how it will end. What I know is that Robert made sure that if there was something to find, it could be found. He left the breadcrumbs in careful order, the way he'd done everything in his life quietly, methodically, without making a scene. That was my son. He was the kind of man who planned 3 steps ahead and never talked about it. He got that from his mother. Patricia used to say that the loudest person in a crisis is never the most useful one. Robert believed that to his bones. I stayed in the house on Caldwell Lane. I want to be clear about why, because some people assumed I stayed out of stubbornness or pride. That's not it. I stayed because Robert bought this house with a down payment I helped him with when he was 32 and just starting out. I stayed because Patricia's sister and her husband live 4 miles down the road, and eating dinner with them on Fridays is the thing that gets me through some weeks. I stayed because the dogwood tree Patricia loved is in the front yard, and I am not going anywhere that tree isn't. I spent the summer putting the house back to rights, not because Vanessa had damaged anything she hadn't, but because I needed the project. I rebuilt the back deck where some boards had started to soften. I cleared out the garage and got my tools set up properly for the first time since I'd moved in. I built a proper workbench along the south wall and hung my hand tools above it on a pegboard the way I always have. Standing in that garage with sawdust on my jeans, with my tools in their places, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, something steadier than that. My neighbor from down the street, a retired postal worker named Gene, started coming over on Saturday mornings after he saw me sanding the deck. He'd bring coffee and sit on an overturned bucket and talk while I worked. His wife had passed 2 years earlier, same as mine. We didn't talk about grief directly. We talked about wood grain and whether the Cardinals were going to make a playoff run and what Gene's daughter was studying at UT. But there was an understanding between us that didn't need naming. I was grateful for it. Patricia's sister Linda asked me one Friday dinner in August how I was doing with everything, not the legal matters. She meant in myself. I thought about it before I answered, which is something I've learned to do. I told her I was okay. I told her I missed Robert every single day and that I probably would for whatever time I had left, and that missing him had become part of me rather than something that was happening to me. She said that sounded about right. She said Patricia would be proud of how I'd handled things. I think about that a lot, whether my wife would be proud. I think she would be proud of Robert. That is what I come back to, again and again, in the quiet evenings. He knew what was coming, and he spent his last months making sure I would be protected. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to burden me, or because he didn't want to poison whatever time we had left with legal talk and fear. He sat with me on that back porch on Sunday afternoons and listened to stories about his mother and let the light fall where it wanted. And all the while he was quietly building a wall around me so that when the storm came, I would still be standing. There's a word for that. I don't think it's just love, although it's that too. I think it's grace, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that you only recognize after the fact, when you're still there and you understand why. I replaced the boards on the back deck with white oak, harder wood, longer lasting. I refinished the surface and treated it 3 times. When I was done, I brought 2 chairs out and set them where Robert and I used to sit. I poured 2 cups of coffee. I sat in my chair and looked at the creek at the back of the yard, moving slow and dark in the late afternoon light. I didn't talk out loud. I'm not much for that. But I stayed out there until the sun was gone, and I finished both cups.